Tonight we're going somewhere far from here, a strip of torn-up earth in northern France and Belgium, barely wider than a few football fields in places, where for 4 years the world tried to kill itself in a straight line. They called it the Western Front. And it started, strangely enough, with movement. To understand how any of this happened, you have to go back a bit further, to June of 1914 and a single gunshot in Sarajevo. A young Bosnian Serb nationalist named Gavrilo Princip shot and killed Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, and his wife Sophie, as their car took a wrong turn almost directly in front of him. It sounds almost accidental, and in a sense, it was. The assassination plot had already failed once that morning, and Princip only got his chance because the driver of the Archduke's car mistakenly turned down the street where he happened to be standing. From that single moment, a tangle of alliances did the rest. Austria-Hungary blamed Serbia and declared war. Russia mobilized to defend Serbia. Germany, bound to Austria-Hungary, declared war on Russia, then on France. Britain, bound by a treaty protecting Belgian neutrality, declared war on Germany after German troops crossed into Belgium. Within about 5 weeks, a regional dispute in the Balkans had pulled in most of Europe's great powers. Nobody sat down and chose this outcome exactly. It arrived through a chain of obligations nobody wanted to be the one to break. In August of 1914, nobody expected a stalemate. German commanders were following a plan drawn up years earlier: sweep through Belgium, encircle Paris, knock France out before Russia could fully mobilize in the east. For a few weeks, it almost worked. Armies marched fast, cavalry scouted ahead, and everyone assumed this war, like the ones before it, would be over by Christmas. It wasn't. By September, the German advance stalled at the Marne, just short of Paris. Both sides then did something that would define the next 4 years. They turned north, each trying to outflank the other, digging in as they went. Historians call this the race to the sea. It wasn't really a race. It was more like two exhausted boxers grabbing hold of each other so neither would fall. By November 1914, a line of trenches ran nearly 475 miles from the Belgian coast down to the Swiss border. Neither army could go around it anymore. There was nowhere left to go around to, so they went down instead. What followed wasn't really warfare in the way people had imagined it. It was closer to a siege that stretched across an entire continent. Picture 2 sets of trenches, sometimes only 50 yards apart, sometimes several hundred, with a churned, cratered stretch of ground between them that soldiers started calling no man's land. Barbed wire in front, machine gun nests behind it, artillery observers watching from both sides. Cross that gap in daylight and a single machine gun, just one, properly placed, could cut down hundreds of men in minutes. That math never really changed for most of the war. Defense had become far, far stronger than offense, and nobody on either side had quite figured out what to do about that yet. Meanwhile, the men living in those trenches were discovering a whole different kind of war. Not the one in the history books, the one nobody had warned them about. Rain turned the trench floors into standing water within days. Men stood in it for hours, sometimes weeks, and their feet, trapped in wet boots and denied circulation, began to rot from the inside. They called it trench foot. In severe cases, the flesh turned gangrenous and had to be amputated. It's estimated that roughly 20,000 British soldiers alone were treated for it in the winter of 1914 into 1915. Not from bullets, from standing still. Then there were the rats, thousands of them, gorging on food scraps, on waste, on the unburied dead lying just beyond the trench walls, because bodies in no man's land often couldn't be retrieved, not without drawing fire. Soldiers wrote home describing rats the size of cats. That's probably not far off. And where there were rats, there was disease. Where there was standing filth, there was lice. Soldiers called them cooties. And lice brought trench fever, a relapsing sickness that could knock a man flat for weeks. You start to notice something, reading soldiers' letters from this period. The enemy they talk about most isn't always the man across no man's land. It's the mud, it's the cold, it's the boredom, stretched thin between short bursts of absolute terror. Most of a soldier's time, honestly, wasn't spent attacking anyone. It was spent maintaining the trench itself, reinforcing collapsing walls, bailing water, repairing wire under cover of darkness, while praying a flare didn't go up and catch you standing there in the open. Rations arrived cold, often as thin tins of bully beef and hard biscuit, sometimes crawling with the same lice that plagued the men eating them. Snipers on both sides watched for any careless head above the parapet, and soldiers learned quickly never to look over the same spot twice. And always, at odd hours, the artillery. Shells arriving with a whistle that soldiers learned to read almost instinctively. A rising shriek meant it was close. A falling one meant you were probably safe, this time. Bombardments could run for days without pause, a constant concussive roar that men described afterward as something felt in the chest and teeth as much as heard. Sleep, under that, became something rationed in scraps, 20 minutes here, an hour there. And then, in April of 1915, something changed that even seasoned soldiers weren't prepared for. Near the Belgian town of Ypres, German forces released roughly 168 tons of chlorine gas from thousands of cylinders dug into their front line, letting the wind carry a greenish-yellow cloud toward French and Algerian colonial troops holding that section of the line. Nobody had a gas mask. Nobody had trained for this. Men who breathed it in described their lungs essentially burning from within, coughing up a foamy yellow fluid as their own bodies drowned them from the inside. Thousands of soldiers broke and fled. A 4-mile gap opened in the Allied line, a gap that, honestly, if German reserves had been ready to exploit it immediately, might have changed the entire war right there. They weren't ready. The moment passed. But something had shifted. Chemical warfare was no longer theoretical. It's worth pausing on that. The men who approved this weren't monsters in the cartoonish sense. They were engineers and generals looking at a stalemate and asking, coldly, what tool might break it? That's almost more unsettling than if it had been simple cruelty. A problem-solving mindset aimed at mass suffering. Both sides used gas after that. Chlorine, then phosgene, then mustard gas by 1917, which blistered skin and eyes on contact and could linger in shell craters for days. Gas never won a battle outright. It didn't need to. It just made every breath something to fear, on top of everything else. Strange thing about this war, though. It wasn't cruelty straight through, not every hour of every day. In December of 1914, along parts of the front, something unplanned happened. German and British soldiers, close enough to hear each other's voices across no man's land, began singing carols back and forth on Christmas Eve. By Christmas Day, in a number of places, men climbed out of their trenches without weapons. They exchanged cigarettes, buttons, tins of food. Some accounts describe informal games of football in the frozen mud between the lines. The details there are genuinely disputed among historians. Some call it a single memorable match. Others say it was smaller and more scattered than legend suggests. But the core event, unarmed men meeting in no man's land, is well documented. It didn't last. Officers on both sides were furious. By the following Christmas, artillery bombardments were deliberately scheduled to prevent it from happening again. But for one day, in the middle of all that, ordinary soldiers decided the war could wait. It resumed. Of course, it resumed. Quick pause here. If you're finding this kind of quiet deep dive into history helpful, dropping a like genuinely helps this reach more people who might need something calm to fall asleep to. And subscribing means you won't miss where we go next. All right, back to 1916. By 1916, the generals were still searching for the breakthrough that would end the stalemate, and two names from that year still carry weight a century later, the Somme and Verdun. Verdun came first, starting in February. The German plan, as one commander reportedly described it, wasn't really to capture ground. It was to bleed France white, to force the French army to defend a symbolically vital fortress city until it broke from sheer exhaustion of manpower. The battle ground on for roughly 10 months. Villages were wiped so completely off the map that some were never rebuilt. They exist today only as markers in the French countryside, officially still destroyed by war, populations of 0. Estimates of total casualties at Verdun, French and German combined, run anywhere from around 700,000 to nearly 1 million, depending on which historian you read and how they count wounded versus missing. The bones of thousands of unidentified soldiers were later gathered into the Douaumont ossuary, where you can still today look through small windows at the base of the building and see skeletal remains stacked below. Not a metaphor. Actual bones from actual men who were never identified and never went home. The French commander most associated with holding Verdun, Philippe Pétain, became a national hero for it. A phrase attributed to French forces there, "Ils ne passeront pas," they shall not pass, became something close to a national motto. It's a strange kind of irony, looking back, that the same man celebrated for defending French soil in 1916 would, roughly 25 years later, become the leader who signed an armistice handing much of that same soil over to Nazi Germany, and later headed the collaborationist Vichy regime. History doesn't always let its heroes stay heroes. Then came July 1st, 1916, the first day of the Battle of the Somme, and quite possibly the single worst day in British military history. British commanders believed a week-long artillery bombardment had destroyed the German defences ahead of the attack. It hadn't. German troops had simply sheltered in deep dugouts and waited it out. When the bombardment lifted and British soldiers climbed out of their trenches, walking, not running, walking as they'd been ordered, weighed down with 60 pounds of equipment, German machine gunners emerged and opened fire on lines of advancing men in the open. By the end of that single day, British forces had suffered around 57,000 casualties, roughly 19,000 of them killed. In one day. The battle itself dragged on until November, advancing the front line in places by barely 5 or 6 miles. Over 1 million men were killed or wounded across both sides during the Somme offensive as a whole. Numbers like that stop meaning much after a while. They blur, the mind sort of slides off them. That's part of the horror, honestly. The scale becomes almost impossible to hold in your head as individual lives. So maybe it helps to zoom in for a moment. A soldier at the Somme was, on average, in his early 20s. Many were teenagers who'd lied about their age to enlist. Britain alone is thought to have sent somewhere around 250,000 underage boys into this war. Whole towns lost the better part of a generation of young men in a single afternoon because so many volunteer units, the famous PALS battalions, had been recruited from the same streets, the same football clubs, the same factories. When those units were cut down together, entire neighbourhoods received their telegrams within days of each other. It wasn't only British and French sons either. Troops from across the empires fought and died on that same soil. Indian regiments, Senegalese and Algerian units fighting for France, Australians and Canadians and New Zealanders who'd crossed entire oceans to reach a war that, for many of them, had little directly to do with their own homelands. Some of these men faced discrimination even as they fought and bled alongside the very armies that recruited them. Their contributions were, for decades afterward, written out of the popular memory of the war almost entirely. Only in recent years have historians started giving that part of the story anything close to its due weight. Meanwhile, away from the trenches themselves, the wider war was reshaping how humanity fought entirely. Aircraft, which had barely existed as weapons a decade earlier, were now dogfighting overhead and dropping bombs. Tanks made their combat debut at the Somme in September 1916, slow, deafening, prone to breaking down or getting stuck in the very craters the artillery had carved out, but unmistakably a hint of what mechanized warfare would become. Of the roughly 49 tanks brought up for that first attack, less than half even made it to the German lines under their own power. Crude as they were, they still terrified German troops who had never seen anything like them crawl out of the smoke. Submarines were strangling supply lines at sea. It was, in fact, Germany's resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare in 1917 that helped drag the United States into the conflict. And back home, women were stepping into factory jobs by the millions, running munitions plants, keeping economies functioning while a generation of men bled out in France and Belgium. The war was total in a way earlier wars simply hadn't been. It reached into homes, kitchens, classrooms, thousands of miles from any trench. There was also a wound this war caused that doctors, at the time, barely had language for. Men were coming back from the front, shaking uncontrollably, unable to speak, reliving explosions that had happened months earlier. Doctors called it shell shock, and for a long while many assumed it had to be physical, some kind of concussion from nearby blasts, a literal injury to the brain from the shockwave itself. It took years and thousands of cases before military medicine began accepting what we'd now recognize immediately as psychological trauma. In the meantime, some men suffering from what we'd now call post-traumatic stress were labeled cowards. A number were court-martialed. Some were executed by their own armies for desertion when what they actually had was an invisible injury nobody yet had a name for. The war finally ground to its end in November 1918, not with a decisive victory in the traditional sense, but with exhaustion. German forces pushed back, its economy and population stretched past breaking, its allies collapsing one by one. An armistice was signed in a railway carriage in the forest of Compiègne, and at 11 o'clock on the morning of November 11th, the guns on the Western Front finally went quiet after more than 4 years. Roughly 9 million soldiers had died. Civilian deaths, when you include famine and disease connected to the war, likely pushed the total past 16 million. An entire generation of young men across Europe was, in the language of the time, simply gone. It's a phrase you still hear, the lost generation, used to describe not just the dead, but the survivors who came home changed beyond recognition, unable to fully explain what they'd seen to anyone who hadn't been there. And the peace that followed didn't really settle anything. The treaty signed at Versailles in 1919 imposed heavy reparations and territorial losses on Germany, terms that, within a generation, would help fuel the resentment a young Austrian corporal named Adolf Hitler would later exploit. Historians still debate how directly one war caused the next. Nobody debates that the line between them is short and disturbingly straight. Today, walking those old fields in northern France, you'd mostly see farmland again, quiet, green, ordinary. But look closer, and the ground still remembers. Farmers there still turn up rusted shell casings with their ploughs every single spring, a slow harvest locals grimly call the Iron Harvest. Certain patches of forest near Verdun remain fenced off even now, a century on, too saturated with unexploded ordnance and old poison gas residue to safely enter. The land itself has never entirely stopped fighting that war, even now, quietly, underground. So tonight, as the trenches settle back into memory and the world around you grows quiet, it might be worth sitting with this for a moment. This war wasn't really decided by grand strategy or heroic charges, not in the end. It was decided by mud, by machine guns, by a kind of industrial patience nobody had ever tested at that scale before. Ordinary men held a line, for years, against horrors we can only partly imagine now, and most of them left no names we remember individually. Just numbers, just villages that stayed silent afterward, missing a generation of sons. If tonight's journey back to those trenches meant something to you, consider leaving a like before you go and subscribing if you'd like to keep drifting back through history with us. It helps more than you'd think, and it costs you nothing but a moment. Sleep well tonight. And remember, as you drift off, that history so often turns on quiet, unglamorous things. A change in the wind carrying gas across a field, a single Christmas Eve carol nobody planned, a line in the mud that held for 4 impossible years. Rest now. We'll go somewhere new next time.